of the contract of the component. Yeah. Capturing the contract means understanding how component is expected to function in terms of from the outside perspective. And it is very important when other person is touching your component and to understand what is safe and what is not safe for refactoring. So the classical view component for component testing is a black box. We should not rely on any of internals implementation, which receive props as input, some other sources as input. We will discuss what other sources a bit later, and generates as outputs three things: side effects like querying our API for something or our GraphQL endpoint, emitting events, and template, which is technically also a side effect, but it is like the main side effect of any component, so I've highlighted is a separate one. Let's speak about each of them one by one. So when we speak about props, what I often see, it's not related to tests, but it's the very first point I'm looking at. Always check the balance of required and optional props. Sometimes we make props which are actually required as optional. Sometimes we are providing wrong default values. It is a very typical error I see in our view components. Second, as we want to capture the contract, it is always a good idea adding the validator for props where complex structure is expected. That sometimes we realize that this prop should receive a very specific array of data, maybe just what, for example, I saw we expect an array of exactly 3 elements, each of them representing each potential state of the component, and so on and so on. And writing complex validators allow us to feel safe when we are consuming the component. But what we often see, just like, okay, this prop is an array and nothing more, and I feel like this is not enough because it actually tells nothing about the structure of expected data. It is safe to write complex validators because even if they're hard to execute in terms of computational power, because they run only in development mode, and it's great to have safety in development mode, which do not affect the production one. But the problem is that our validator checks the value provided to the prop outside context of the component. So it can't handle, for example, the simplest example. We have a drop-down, so we are passing the items to the drop-down and obviously the value of the drop-down. And the value could not be, obviously should be one of the items provided. These things could not be expressed with validator because validator does not have access to the other props, to the context, and so on. So it is always great for such components to have and to request from a component author the test to verify that component properly reacts, either by throwing error or reacting in some sane way when we have incontestable props incoming. It helps us to build a safer developer environment. When we speak about other sources, we mean that basically the data could be obtained by the component not only via props, but also via Vuex, Apollo, context, which provide inject. And according to our current testing guide and testing levels, it should be mocked for component tests. Mocking it allows us to understand which part of this, let's call it remote state, is required for this component to function. But building the proper mocks for such stores is hard because mocks could easily get out of date without breaking test. We updated our store structure, but forgot to update the other component test which mocks this store. What I usually see and what feels like a good trade-off for me is that when we are mocking Vuex store, we are usually trying to reuse this store state, which is usually separated in our code base, but we mock actions. Luckily, we do not have mutations we do not call mutations from components. So this usually means that as soon as you mock actions, you do not need to mock any mutations, because with mocked actions, no mutations will be ever called. If this is not an option, you should consider always using fixtures as much as possible, because at least they generated from backend. And here we currently do not have any way, at least we do not have at the moment, the thing to generate fixtures from GraphQL queries. This is probably something we should work with backend team to address. And like the very, very last resort is to use hard-coded values, because it's, like I said, it's very easy to miss, because you will never know when you are factoring store where this store is mocked. So what about template? Testing template is simple in view 3, because in view 3 we will have source maps, which allows us to have a code coverage and to understand if all our template options are covered with our unit test, which is usually a good idea and should be quite easy to reach. But since while we are stuck to view 2, just keep an eye on each if we show, and just to check manually with your eyes, unfortunately, to understand if both sides of the if is covered by the tests. Things are pretty simple here. I'm intentionally not touching right now the shallow mount versus mount Holyvar about querying elements or so on. There are an awesome discussion in RFCs. There is a merge request from Justin to clarify things a bit more in our documentation, which I hope will land somewhere very soon. I believe Sarah, who is a reviewer, was happy about latest changes. But right now, it's no matter what approach you are using, just make sure that all possible branches of template rendering is covered, because from what I see from reviewing, loading states are often missed from proper testing. Another point I would like to mention here is that you should be extremely careful about negative tests, like checking that something is not rendered and like stopping on that is usually a fragile approach, because like you change the component which is rendered in loading state and the still passes because it is not rendering the new component, and so on and so on. So when looking for any kind of assertions for template, it is always good to check if we have any kind of positive assertion for each test, because tests with negative assertions tries to keep false positive, and I saw it multiple times when refactoring our view components. Spoilers, when we speak about events, it is extremely important to test each possible emit. That means that right now, without in view 3, in view 2, there is no way to describe like this component should emit only these events, and when we are shallow mounting our component in any other test, there is no way to make sure that this event is available. So when we have events, we should always, for any event in the component, have tests which allows us to understand when this event is emitted. And this is like a great opportunity to utilize mutation testing. So basically the idea is that we should pick our view component, mutate the name of any emit we found, like we do not generate this event, and the test should turn red. If any of such mutation survives, that means that this event emitting in our component is not enough, and the component test lacks some important details. So obviously, like I said, it is very important when we are shallow mounting components, and I want to do a slight touch on shallow mount versus mount topic, that when we use shallow mount of our component, there is no guarantee that our component could potentially emit the event, which we manually emit using .vm $emit on the component. This will be solved in view3, where in component we could declare emit section, which explicitly declares all events of the component which could be emitted. And basically, I have a very, very hacky solution not ready to be published, but it could be with no performance penalty introduced to view2. And we could slowly migrate our components to from view2 to view3, like making them view3 ready, making sure that our tests which use shallow mount, sorry, I'm a shallow mount person, guilty, to make sure that our tests like we do not emit impossible events. View test utils could be easily updated to check when we have emit section that we emitting a possible event. And it's like a good step for a view3 migration, which Natalia already created Epic. And I see like a very huge benefit for our testing code base from doing this. So like red flags when you're looking for tests. The first obvious, yet I still see the test, no new test should use our mount component helper. If you import the view component, you expect it to test it with view test utils. For new tests, like no new options. It is bad idea to test computed or data because they're component internals. We should not in component tests rely how certain computed works and how internal state, which is data, is represented. And this is very important because like testing computables is fast and is pretty much useless and creates unnecessary red tests when you are refactoring. And another very, very red flag is calling set methods, which is deprecating in view test utils. It's already show blocker for us to updating to version 1.0.0. And when you're using set method, you're actually replacing internal component implementation. And sometimes I saw like people spying on the method and like replacing this set methods with something like just .fn. And this shouldn't be done because calling internal method is also not an observable effect. For me, there are no known use cases when we should do any of these three, and this should consider it as red flags. There are yellow flags, which should always raise a question and have a good explanation why we are doing that. First of all is using the set data to modify the component data and using the data option to pass the data of the component, because data is component internal state. Unfortunately, this is, for example, the only way we could test right now the components which are using View Apollo, because View Apollo just sets the state to the data. There is an RFC by Natalia how we can do this in integration tests. And this is like what I think this should be definitely doing not only on integration level, which is like way too high for this one, but also on unit tests. So like spoilers, I'm working on approach how we could deal with this in, so I hope you will have an RFC coming from me in the nearest week. So another one is a create local view, which was needed in our karma tests. Also, which was long ago available in the view test utils documentation. And so now people were copying and pasting it. So basically the rule is very simple. We should use only local view if we are using local view.use for introducing something like Vuex or Apollo to the test. Or sometimes we need to mock directives. There is no way to mock.
Sorry, I don't
Yes.
mean to stop you. No, I'm just giving a time box warning of maybe 2-ish minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
We are exactly in the time frame. So we have the directive here. And the last one is the SetProps, which should be used to test only reactive changes. So when we need to check that how component is reacting to some changes to props, but not just this pattern we will see very soon. So just very few examples. This one, we are using the set data to set the component. Actually, this is the bad example with a bad copy paste. So we are just setting this loading true is the data, which will be passed to the component, and we are testing the computed property. Bad approach. Here is the SetProps I was talking about. This is a common pattern seen in in a lot of old tests when we are creating component, and instead of creating it in each test, we are just doing the SetProps setting props. So this is one component still tracking the old like gathering data for each test and so on and so on, and this is bad. We're expecting to create a component, fresh component for each test. And the third one is like we are using set methods to swap some unknown method and to check just that when we trigger click, this method is called, and this like contributes nothing to component external behavior. You see probably like these lintable badges. This is the things which are potentially lintable, and we could implement that. So I've created Epic in our frontend group for GitLab lint plugin. So we could jump in and create some lints so we could focus more on other things. But right now, I believe that's all. So I will be happy to hear your questions. It is just me, or just cam quality is way better than the normal webcam, or it is like a special photo camera installed, captured by Blackmagic at a mini device, and it's like insane setup used for streaming. Yeah, mutation testing by replacing if and if true false is a good way to test if certain breaches have been covered. Yes, thank you, Paul. It's a great note. It's just a bit harder to implement, but it's like a good way. I have one day to research when I have time. It's really a good approach. For set methods, what about replacing them for mocked function during the mounting process? I believe I covered this in my slides. I think it's not. So I believe like no more questions. I will share obviously slides in the documents. Sorry for like, I would like to keep it.
Sorry, there are questions in the document as well.
Yeah, sorry, 1 second, I will open it. 1 second, I'm a bit lost with sorry. So, is it worth writing a prop validator for data structure that's coming directly from the backend? It depends. I believe that if we are just adding something from directly from backend, I feel we are usually fine. But sometimes we are handcrafting front-end based structure, and we have some expectation on it. So if it just goes straight from backend, I think we are fine. If we have some handcrafting thing, I believe it is great to have validator. So I really love when component complains when I try to shoot myself in the leg with that component. So let's do it. Slides. Let's put it the link here. Slides shared. I see, Rob. Yeah. I'm not convinced that SetProps is a bad idea. As long as the component is recreating for each test, there are not going to be any leakage between tests. Plus, it's just one of the inputs of the component. Changing this is not valid. Like you are creating additional complexity to the test, and it's additional mental complexity. When I see SetProps, I'm thinking like you have a component and now you're changing it. Do we are testing something which is change related? Like, please don't make me think. I really love like we are directly setting the props creating when we create the component, because it's like a no-brainer. I like here is the state we have in the component. Here is the checks we are running. Yeah, like there is in discussion, testing vouchers is like the only for me use case when using SetProps. There are a few things when we need, I believe, when we need, for example, to call methods. I usually saw that when GS DOM is not capable of doing something. For example, it is focus related, but in general, other things should be okay. The performance hit on creating component is very low. Sometimes even setting props is harder than recreating the component. And what I saw for even our huge tests, it is like less than 0.1 second difference on my laptop, probably like 5 times higher on CI. So
I think with SetProps too, and Andrew brings up a good point about some organization of tests and the fact that we've had to migrate so many tests from Karma. Like sometimes I think, to me, if you're using SetProps, it's not necessarily a blocker unless there's a huge readability hit. But the fact that we've had to migrate some tests from Karma, you can see how, based on past organization of the specs, like this just made some things easier.
Yes, it's a common pattern for our tests which were written in Karma. Like I said, there are a lot of potential issues with our old tests, but I think for new tests, sometimes we could organize a test that readability will be the same. And I believe, it's my personal preference, like not a strong opinion, that the mental load of using props data instead of SetProps is lower.
Yeah, I think there's something nice about having like a single component created at the top of the file that you kind of mutate and use over and over. Not necessarily for performance or readability reasons, but perhaps for aesthetic reasons. And then you gotta go and
understand,
yeah, and then you gotta go and reorganize all these tests, and you're like, oh, why did I make all this extra
But
work?
one thing I've already encountered, I believe, 4 times when I was preparing our test for previous Vue test utils update, that like you are just changing the order of the test inside the test suite, and they start to fail. Because like I said, the setting props is modifying internal state of the component, and sometimes it's unobvious. Like my internal like beauty test verifier is also hit by this one. And I really like, for example, how we could redefine that blocks in the Ruby specs. With let, we could redefining the things inside the describe blocks. But unfortunately, I believe just could not propose something similar for us for now. So yes, we should suffer a bit.
Cool. Thanks, Ilya, for talking about this. And I know there's so much discussion that we should probably maybe continue discussion next week. Dennis, we've been kicking your point down.
I kind of got used to that.
Do you want to kind of
No.
pick it up in the next 2 minutes?
No, thank you.
Okay,
I'm fine.
All right. I really want to talk about it because it's interesting and affects us. But I'm sorry that it's been kicked again.
Yeah, we'll take it in a couple of weeks. I'm on vacation
Yeah, I'm on vacation next week, so we'll take it in a couple of weeks, and then it will completely lose any point because we will have so many maintainers that we will be asking for some reviews.
Okay.
Sorry, Dennis. I'm a chatterbox.
That's fine. That's fine. That's why we have the time boxing.
Dennis, I know.
Do we
Well,
want to try to consider maybe a once a month meeting that is
longer.
discussion only and not doesn't contain any training?
That's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, maybe oh, and that reminds me. Ilya's was the last scheduled training that someone said, "Hey, I'll talk about something." So we might actually naturally be there anyways. But if someone has at the top of this agenda document, there's an issue for training topics. If someone has something, hey, here's something I'd like to talk about, that'd be cool. Last handful of training topics have been really interesting and helpful and very organized. But don't let that shy you away from sharing your unorganized thoughts. So please check that out. And for the last minute, one thing that came up for me recently in a review, which I'd like to raise awareness of, is we have a very cool component called local storage sync. So I sent a link to the comment, not to the component itself. Let me share my screen for 1 minute. Basically, we were inlining inside the store state, reading from local storage. And this kind of side effecty stuff would be really nice kept outside of making our stores very complex. So I'm a huge fan of reactive programming and then making very simple modules that react based on each other. And so part of that, we have a very cool component called local storage sync. So anytime there's someone creating an MR like, hey, we want to sync this part of the state to local storage, rather than re-implementing the wheel, let's look into reusing this component or some sort of other reactive solution. Just raising awareness there. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but it's time. Yeah. Well, cool, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. And Ilya, thanks so much. And Dennis, thanks for being graceful and flexible. And yeah, we'll continue the interesting discussion next time. Adios.